As you settle into comfort, preparing for rest, imagine your consciousness slowly detaching from the immediate concerns of the day. The unanswered messages, the passing conversations, tomorrow's plans, all begin to recede like shadows at twilight. Tonight, you embark on a different kind of journey, not across physical terrain, but through the landscape of human cognition that shapes how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. You may wonder why cognitive biases matter. The answer lies in something you've likely experienced. That moment when you realized a cherished belief was based on incomplete information, or when you discovered that two people could witness the same event, yet walk away with entirely different memories of what occurred. In these moments, you glimpse the invisible architecture of perception, the mental shortcuts, intuitive judgments, and unconscious tendencies that filter and form our reality before conscious thought even begins. Tonight, we'll explore these cognitive patterns together, not as flaws to be eliminated, but as fascinating features of our mental landscape that deserve understanding. I invite you to approach these biases with gentle curiosity. Some patterns may feel uncomfortably familiar. Others might reveal blind spots you never knew existed. All of them belong to our shared human inheritance, the evolved tendencies that helped our ancestors survive, but sometimes lead us astray in our complex modern world. Imagine yourself walking along a quiet path as evening approaches. The air carries a slight chill, touching your skin with the gentle reminder of your embodied existence. Somewhere nearby, water trickles over stones in a small stream. This path winds through what appears to be an elaborate garden. But unlike ordinary gardens that cultivate plants, this one cultivates perceptions. It is the garden of your mind, where reality is not simply observed, but actively constructed through processes largely hidden from conscious awareness. As your eyes adjust to the deepening twilight, you notice something unusual about this garden. Various sections are illuminated differently, some bathed in clear, even light, others slightly distorted by unusual shadows. Still others magnified or minimized in apparent importance. These variations in perception don't occur randomly, but follow patterns, the cognitive biases that shape your mental landscape. The journey we're about to undertake, begins a calm voice beside you, starts with perhaps the most fundamental insight about human cognition. We do not passively receive information about the world like a camera or recording device. Instead, our minds actively construct our reality, selecting, filtering, and interpreting information in ways that often prioritize efficiency over accuracy, coherence over completeness, and confirmation over contradiction. As this voice speaks, you feel yourself sinking deeper into receptive awareness. The garden path before you seems both more vivid and more dreamlike. The boundary between your conscious thoughts and the narrative unfolding before you becomes pleasantly blurred. You are both participant and observer in this journey, considering these patterns of mind and being considered by them. Before we explore specific biases, the voice continues, I want to invite you to notice something about perception itself. Right now, you may feel as though you're seeing the garden around you completely and continuously. Yet scientific research reveals that your eyes actually dart about in rapid movements called saccades, focusing on specific points of interest while your brain fills in the rest. You perceive not the garden as it objectively exists, but a mental model your mind constructs, a useful but ultimately limited representation of reality. You notice your breathing has naturally slowed, Each breath now feels like a gentle tide, carrying you deeper into contemplation. The twilight deepens around you in the garden, and stars begin to appear overhead, points of clarity in the vast unknown. Your body feels heavier, more connected to the earth beneath you, while your mind feels increasingly spacious, ready to explore the cognitive patterns that frame your experience of reality. The biases we'll explore tonight, continues the voice, have been discovered and documented through decades of research in cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience. They aren't random bugs in our mental software, but predictable patterns that emerged for good evolutionary reasons. These tendencies helped our ancestors survive in environments where fast, good enough decisions were often more valuable than slow, perfect ones. Understanding these patterns doesn't eliminate them, but it does offer a kind of freedom, the ability to recognize when they might be influencing us and to adjust our thinking accordingly. As you listen, you begin to feel a subtle shift in your perception. The garden around you seems to expand, becoming a metaphor for consciousness itself, a cultivated space where reality takes the form your mind gives it, where what you perceive depends not just on what exists, but on what you expect, value, fear, or desire. You're aware of the weight of your body sinking deeper into comfort, while your mind remains gently alert, receptive to insights about the hidden patterns that shape your experience. Are you ready? Asks the voice, though it's not really a question requiring an answer. It's an invitation to presence, to full engagement with the journey about to unfold. You feel yourself nodding almost imperceptibly, and with that small gesture of consent, you cross the threshold into the realm of cognitive exploration, the fascinating study of how our minds systematically shape our perception of reality in ways we rarely notice, but that influence every aspect of our lives. The first stars now shine overhead with remarkable clarity, each one a point of wonder in the darkening sky. Your eyelids may feel heavy at times, and that's perfectly natural. This journey is designed to accompany you even as you drift between wakefulness and sleep, planting seeds of insight that will continue to unfold in your dreams and perhaps emerge in new forms when morning comes. Our first exploration, the voice begins, concerns a foundational cognitive tendency called confirmation bias, our natural inclination to notice, seek out, and remember information that confirms what we already believe while overlooking or dismissing evidence that contradicts our existing views. This bias doesn't stem from dishonesty or stubbornness, but from the mind's fundamental drive for cognitive efficiency and consistency. As these words are spoken, a section of the garden illuminates before you. You notice how certain flowers, representing ideas and information, seem to glow more brightly when they align with the existing pattern of the garden, while those that would disrupt the established design fade into shadow, not because they're less real or valuable, but because your attention naturally gravitates toward what fits your existing mental model. Consider how this bias might shape something as seemingly objective as your news consumption, suggests the voice. When you encounter a headline that confirms your political views, you likely feel an immediate sense of validation. I knew it. And may read the article carefully, share it with others, and remember its details. But when you see a headline that challenges those same views, you might experience a subtle resistance. That can't be right. And scroll past, or if you do read it, scrutinize it for flaws in a way you wouldn't with agreeable information. This example materializes in the garden as a pathway that forks, then rejoins, showing how the same person presented with information that confirms versus challenges their existing beliefs follows different mental processes, applying rigorous skepticism to contradictory evidence while accepting confirming evidence with minimal scrutiny. Neither path represents intentional dishonesty. Both emerge from the mind's natural tendency toward consistency. What makes confirmation bias so powerful, the voice explains, is that it operates largely beneath conscious awareness. You don't decide to ignore contradictory evidence. You simply find it less attention-grabbing, less memorable, and more questionable than confirming evidence. This bias creates feedback loops that can strengthen your convictions over time, regardless of their accuracy, as you unconsciously cultivate a garden of evidence that blooms with confirmation while shadows obscure contradiction. The garden around you seems to shimmer slightly as you prepare to delve into this first great cognitive pattern, your mind now perfectly balanced between alertness and tranquility, ready to explore the invisible forces that shape your reality as you continue this journey into the heart of human perception. The path winds deeper into the garden, where further cognitive patterns await, each connected to confirmation bias, yet revealing new dimensions of how your mind constructs the reality you experience as self-evident truth. As we move forward, the voice continues with gentle resonance. Notice how confirmation bias doesn't exist in isolation, but connects to many other patterns of mind. Each bias we explore will reveal another aspect of how your perception is shaped not just by what exists around you, but by the evolved patterns of attention, memory, and judgment that helped humans survive and thrive across countless generations. Together, these patterns form the hidden architecture of your reality, the usually invisible structures that support the world as you experience it. The garden path curves ahead, leading toward a section where the interplay of light and shadow creates intriguing patterns, representing the next cognitive bias awaiting your exploration. Your journey through the landscape of perception continues, each step revealing more about how your mind constructs the reality you inhabit, each insight offering both understanding and the potential for greater wisdom about yourself and the human condition we all share. As you continue along the garden path, the landscape gradually transforms. The open spaces with their selectively illuminated flora give way to a curious structure that emerges from the twilight mist. Before you stands what appears to be a hall of mirrors, though unlike the carnival attractions designed for simple amusement, these mirrors serve a deeper purpose. They reflect not just your physical form, but the very process of self-perception. We now enter the domain of the self-serving bias, the voice explains, as you step into this reflective gallery. This is our natural tendency to attribute positive events and successes to our own character, abilities, and efforts, while blaming negative outcomes and failures on external circumstances, bad luck, or the actions of others. As you move between the mirrors, you notice how each one subtly alters your reflection. Some emphasize your best features and achievements, making them appear entirely the result of your inherent qualities. Others minimize your mistakes and disappointments, shifting focus to the external factors that contributed to them. The overall effect is a version of yourself that feels comfortable and affirming, even if not entirely accurate. This bias works so seamlessly that we rarely notice its influence, continues the voice, now seeming to emanate from the mirrors themselves. When you receive praise for a project at work, you likely attribute this success to your intelligence, creativity, and dedication. But when your idea is criticized, you might find yourself thinking about the tight deadline you were given, the unclear instructions, or the particularly difficult audience. Same person, same abilities, but the mirror of self-perception shifts depending on the outcome. You watch as scenes play out across the reflective surfaces around you, small vignettes of everyday life where this bias subtly shapes interpretation. A student who aces an exam thinks, "I'm naturally good at this subject and studied effectively," while the same student receiving a poor grade thinks, "The test was unfair and I had too many other assignments that week." Neither explanation is necessarily wrong, but together they reveal the mind's tendency to protect self-image through selective attribution. The self-serving bias serves important psychological functions, the voice notes. It helps maintain self-esteem and motivation in the face of life's inevitable setbacks. Imagine if you attributed every failure to inherent personal flaws and every success to mere luck. Such thinking would likely lead to helplessness and depression. However, when this bias goes unchecked, it can prevent genuine self-improvement and learning from mistakes. It can also strain relationships when we fail to take responsibility for actions that affect others. The Hall of Mirrors now opens into a circular chamber where multiple reflections create an unusual effect. You can see yourself from perspectives that would normally be impossible. This represents the rare but valuable moments of clarity when we manage to step outside our self-serving narratives and view our actions and outcomes with greater objectivity. Cultivating awareness of this bias doesn't mean harshly blaming yourself for every failure or dismissing your role in successes, the voice explains. Rather, it invites a more balanced perspective, recognizing that both positive and negative outcomes usually result from a mixture of personal factors and external circumstances. With practice, you can develop the capacity to ask, "What was my contribution to this outcome, and what factors were beyond my control?" This more nuanced self-reflection leads to both greater self-compassion and more effective learning. As you contemplate this insight, you notice how the self-serving bias connects naturally to confirmation bias. Together, they create a reinforcing system that maintains a coherent self-image. You selectively seek and remember information that confirms your positive qualities, confirmation bias, while attributing positive outcomes to those same qualities and negative outcomes to external factors, self-serving bias. This interconnected pattern helps explain why accurate self-assessment can be so challenging for even the most self-aware individuals. Let's continue our journey, the voice suggests, to explore a bias that shapes not just how we see ourselves, but how we perceive others and their motivations. The Hall of Mirrors gradually transitions into a theater-like space with a small stage at its center. Here, you take a comfortable seat as the area dims except for soft illumination on the stage, where scenes begin to unfold, depicting human interactions of various kinds, some harmonious, others marked by misunderstanding or conflict. We now encounter the fundamental attribution error, the voice explains. Our tendency to explain others' behavior predominantly in terms of their character and intentions, while underestimating the influence of situational factors. Simultaneously, as we've just seen with the self-serving bias, we often do the opposite when explaining our own actions, emphasizing how circumstances influenced our behavior. On the stage, you watch a simple scenario play out. A person rushes past another without acknowledging them, accidentally bumping their shoulder. You notice how easily your mind constructs a narrative about this person. Perhaps they're rude, self-absorbed, inconsiderate. Then the scene expands to reveal what you couldn't see initially. The person was rushing to help someone in distress, their attention entirely focused on responding to an emergency. We are natural storytellers, says the voice, constantly creating narratives to explain the behaviors we observe. But our stories about others often suffer from limited information. We see their actions, but not the complex mix of pressures, constraints, emotions, and goals influencing them. Without access to this internal and contextual information, we default to explanations based on personality and intention. She's inconsiderate, rather than she's responding to circumstances I can't see. The stage now displays a series of scenarios showing how this bias affects relationships, workplaces, and broader society. You see how easy it is to judge a colleague who missed a deadline as irresponsible without knowing about their family crisis, or to assume a friend who cancels plans is flaky rather than struggling with anxiety or exhaustion. This bias has profound implications for how we judge and interact with others, continues the voice. It can lead to unnecessary conflict when we assume negative intentions behind actions actually caused by circumstances. It contributes to the tendency to blame individuals for problems that have primarily structural or situational causes. And it can prevent us from extending the same compassion and benefit of the doubt to others that we naturally give ourselves. As you watch these scenarios, you begin to notice connections between the fundamental attribution error and the biases you've already explored. Like confirmation bias, it leads us to seek explanations that fit our existing beliefs about others. If we've already labeled someone as difficult, we'll readily attribute their actions to this trait while overlooking situational factors. And like the self-serving bias, it creates an asymmetry in how we explain behavior, but now between self and other, rather than between success and failure. The antidote to this bias, suggests the voice, is cultivating what psychologists call empathic accuracy, the ability to accurately infer others' thoughts, feelings, and motivations. This doesn't mean naively assuming the best about everyone, but rather suspending immediate judgment to consider the range of possible explanations for behavior. What circumstances might be influencing this person that I can't see? What pressures might they be responding to? What might this situation look like from their perspective? The theatrical space gradually dims, leaving only a gentle ambient light that guides you toward the next area of the garden. As you rise and follow this illuminated path, you notice your body feels pleasantly heavy, ready for deeper rest, while your mind remains engaged but increasingly tranquil, absorbing these insights about the invisible patterns that shape social perception. As we continue, the voice says, its tone becoming even more measured and soothing, we'll explore how these biases in perception extend beyond individuals to shape how we understand and remember events. The path ahead leads to a place where time itself seems to flow differently, revealing how memory, often trusted as a faithful record of experience, is actually a creative process shaped by cognitive biases of its own. The path now curves beside a gentle stream whose water catches moonlight in rippling patterns. The sound of flowing water creates a rhythmic backdrop that enhances your growing tranquility while still maintaining gentle alertness to the insights unfolding before you. Ahead, you can see what appears to be an ancient library emerging from the evening mist. A repository not of books, but of memories, where the next chapter of your exploration into cognitive biases awaits. As you approach this memory archive, you notice how the building itself seems to subtly shift and reconstruct. walls and windows appearing slightly different each time you look at them, mirroring the very process of memory reconstruction you're about to explore. The water's murmur blends with the voice's gentle cadence, creating a hypnotic harmony that deepens your relaxation while maintaining your engagement with the journey through the landscape of mind. The biases we've explored so far, confirmation bias, self-serving bias, and fundamental attribution error, all influence how we perceive and interpret the present moment, notes the voice. But our minds don't just construct our immediate reality, they also continuously rebuild our past through processes just as susceptible to systematic distortion. Memory, contrary to common belief, is not a simple recording to be played back, but an active reconstruction vulnerable to predictable patterns of bias. With these words, you cross the threshold into the memory archive, where cognitive biases that shape how we remember and misremember our experiences await your discovery. The journey deepens, moving from the biases of perception toward those that influence how we construct our personal and collective histories, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we've experienced on our path through life. As you step into the memory archive, you're enveloped in a gentle amber light that seems to emanate not from any visible source, but from the air itself. The space around you resembles an ancient library merged with a natural cave system. Shelves and alcoves carved directly into living stone, holding not books, but glowing memory vessels of various shapes and sizes. Some shine with crystal clarity, others appear cloudy or partially obscured. Throughout the archive, you notice archivists at work, not preserving memories exactly as they were formed, but actively editing, connecting, and sometimes even creating them anew. Welcome to the domain of memory biases, the voice intones, now seeming to resonate from the very walls of the archive. Here, we encounter one of the most profound insights of cognitive science. Memory is not a passive recording system, but an active, constructive process. Your mind doesn't simply store and retrieve experiences like files in a cabinet. It reconstructs them anew each time, often introducing systematic distortions that serve psychological needs rather than historical accuracy. As you move deeper into the archive, your attention is drawn to a circular chamber where memory reconstruction is happening before your eyes. In the center stands what appears to be a holographic display showing a memory being formed, stored, and later retrieved. You watch as the original experience, rich in sensory detail and emotional nuance, is simplified during storage, with only key elements preserved. Then, during retrieval, you observe the mind filling in missing details, reorganizing elements for coherence, and subtly aligning the memory with current beliefs and self-image. This process reveals our first memory bias, the hindsight bias, explains the voice. This is our tendency, after an event has occurred, to believe we knew or predicted the outcome all along. The "I knew it all along" effect. This bias creates a false impression that the world is more predictable than it actually is, while also giving us an inflated sense of our own foresight. The holographic display shifts to show examples of hindsight bias in action. Investors claiming they knew a market crash was coming after it happened. Sports fans saying they never doubted their team would win after a victory. Individuals insisting they had a feeling about an unexpected event. In each case, the memory of their prior expectations is unconsciously revised to align with knowledge of the outcome. Hindsight bias occurs because your mind automatically integrates new information into your existing knowledge structures, continues the voice. Once you know an outcome, your mind updates your understanding so completely that it becomes difficult to recall your previous state of ignorance or uncertainty. The path that led to the outcome seems clearer in retrospect than it did in prospect, creating an illusion of predictability and often an overestimation of your own foresight. You watch as memory vessels throughout the chamber subtly realign themselves after new information enters, showing how knowledge of outcomes retroactively reorganizes memories of predictions and expectations. This visualization helps you understand why the bias feels so seamless. It's not a deliberate revision, but an automatic result of how memory integrates new knowledge. Hindsight bias has significant implications, the voice notes. It can lead to overconfidence in decision-making, as we remember our past judgments as better than they were. It can create unfair blame when we judge others' decisions based on outcomes that weren't predictable in advance. And it can prevent genuine learning from experience when we falsely believe we already anticipated what actually surprised us. As you contemplate these implications, the archive path leads you to a new chamber where another memory bias manifests. Here, memory vessels are organized chronologically, but you notice something curious. Recent memories appear in standard proportion, while childhood and early life memories seem disproportionately abundant and vivid compared to memories from middle periods of life. This chamber reveals the reminiscence bump, explains the voice. People typically remember a disproportionate number of events from adolescence and early adulthood compared to other life periods. This bump occurs across cultures and throughout history, suggesting it reflects fundamental properties of human memory rather than specific cultural influences. The chamber illustrates this phenomenon through a lifetime timeline, where memory density peaks during the ages of approximately 15 to 30, a period when many people experience significant firsts: first romantic relationship, first job, first independent home, first child. These novelty-rich, identity-forming experiences receive preferential encoding in long-term memory, creating an abundance of accessible recollections from this life chapter. The reminiscence bump reveals something profound about autobiographical memory, the voice continues. Memory isn't simply about preserving the past. It's intimately connected to identity formation. We remember best the experiences that helped shape who we became. This period of life typically involves crystallizing personal values, establishing adult relationships, and making formative career choices, all central components of identity development. As you reflect on your own memory landscape, you might notice this pattern. How certain periods of your life remain richly detailed in memory, while others have faded, not necessarily because the faded periods were less happy or important, but because they contributed less to your sense of who you are. The path now curves toward a chamber where memory vessels appear in clusters of varying emotional intensity. Some glow with warm hues, suggesting positive emotion. Others pulse with cooler tones, indicating negative experiences. You notice that the emotional memories seem more vivid and detailed than neutral ones, but also that the positive clusters generally outnumber the negative ones for memories distant in time. This chamber demonstrates two interconnected memory biases, explains the voice. First, the emotional enhancement of memory, our tendency to remember emotionally charged events more vividly and in greater detail than neutral events. And second, the fading effect bias, the tendency for the emotional impact of negative memories to fade faster than that of positive memories for most psychologically healthy individuals. The display shows how emotional arousal during an experience triggers special encoding mechanisms that create stronger, more detailed memories. You can see neurotransmitters flooding neural pathways during emotional events, creating memory traces resistant to forgetting. Yet, for negative memories specifically, you observe a gradual dulling of emotional intensity over time, while positive memories retain their emotional vibrancy. These biases serve important psychological functions, notes the voice. Emotional enhancement of memory helps us learn quickly from significant experiences, especially potential threats. The fading affect bias, meanwhile, supports psychological well-being by gradually reducing the sting of past hurts while preserving the warmth of positive experiences. Together, they help explain why our autobiographical narratives tend to become more positive over time, not through deliberate revision, but through these automatic memory processes. As the implications of these memory biases settle into your awareness, you begin to notice how they connect with the perceptual biases you encountered earlier. Confirmation bias influences not just what information we notice, but what we remember. Self-serving bias affects how we reconstruct memories of our successes and failures. Hindsight bias creates an illusion of predictability that reinforces our sense of understanding the world. The path continues to a chamber where memory vessels appear incomplete or partially constructed. Here, archivists work diligently to fill gaps in memories, sometimes using information that wasn't part of the original experience at all. You watch as memories are inadvertently blended with later acquired knowledge, suggestions from others, and even completely fictional elements that nevertheless become integrated into what feels like authentic recollection. This chamber reveals false memory and suggestibility, explains the voice. Human memory is remarkably susceptible to suggestion and contamination. We can develop detailed, emotionally compelling memories of events that never occurred or happened quite differently than we remember. These aren't lies or deliberate fabrications, but genuine memory errors resulting from how our minds reconstruct the past. The display shows various ways false memories form: through leading questions that implant suggestions, through repeated imaginings that become confused with actual experiences, through social influence when others describe their recollections, and through the mind's natural tendency to fill gaps with plausible details rather than leaving them empty. False memories reveal the constructive nature of memory at its most dramatic, continues the voice. Your mind prioritizes creating a coherent, meaningful narrative over maintaining perfect historical accuracy. This serves you well in many contexts. You don't need photographic recall of every detail to learn life lessons from experience. But it also means your most confident, detailed memories can sometimes be partially or entirely false without your awareness. As you contemplate this unsettling reality, you notice your body feels increasingly heavy and relaxed, while your mind remains engaged, but in an increasingly dreamy, contemplative state. The amber light of the archive seems to pulse gently in rhythm with your breathing, creating a hypnotic effect that deepens your tranquility. Before we leave the memory archive, the voice says, its tone growing even more soothing, consider how these memory biases shape your life story. The narrative you carry about who you are and how you came to be this person isn't simply a record of events, but a continually reconstructed creation, one shaped by cognitive biases that generally support psychological well-being, identity maintenance, and efficient learning, even at the cost of perfect accuracy. The entire archive now appears as a vast, integrated system, with connections between memory vessels creating a coherent, autobiographical narrative. You can see how the system prioritizes meaning over precision, emotional significance over comprehensiveness, and identity consistency over perfect factual recall, not because of failure, but by design, as these priorities served human survival and flourishing throughout our evolutionary history. As we prepare to leave the memory archive, the voice suggests, notice that awareness of these biases doesn't eliminate them. Your memories will continue to reconstruct themselves according to these patterns, but understanding them offers a kind of metacognitive wisdom, the ability to hold your memories with appropriate confidence rather than mistaking them for perfect recordings, and the capacity to appreciate how your mind constructs not just your present reality, but your personal past. The path now leads toward an exit from the archive, where the amber light gradually shifts to a cooler silvery illumination. Ahead lies what appears to be an observatory, a structure designed not for viewing distant stars, but for perceiving patterns in the world around us, particularly those involving probability, risk, and uncertainty. Here, you'll explore the cognitive biases that shape not just how we perceive the present and remember the past, but how we anticipate and plan for the future. As you move toward this new territory, you carry the insights from the memory archive with you, understanding that your mind constructs your personal history through systematic patterns that prioritize meaning, coherence, and identity maintenance over perfect accuracy. This awareness doesn't eliminate these biases, but offers perspective on the constructed nature of your autobiographical narrative, a perspective that can support both self-understanding and compassion for others whose memories may differ from yours, even when experiences were shared. The soothing rhythm of your breathing continues to deepen your relaxation as you approach the observatory of probability, where new insights await about how cognitive biases shape your assessment of risk, uncertainty, and future possibilities. The journey through the landscape of mind continues, each territory revealing another aspect of how your reality is constructed, not just from what exists objectively around you, but from how your evolved cognitive tendencies selectively perceive, interpret, and remember your lived experience. As you approach the observatory, its unique architecture comes into view, a circular structure topped with a domed ceiling that opens not to the night sky, but to a constantly shifting projection of possible futures. Unlike traditional observatories designed to bring distant objects closer, this one seems built to bring clarity to the inherently fuzzy realm of probability and risk assessment. The silvery illumination you glimpsed from a distance now reveals itself as emanating from countless shifting probability fields that hover in the air like luminous clouds. Welcome to the Observatory of Probability, the voice greets you as you enter. Here, we explore how cognitive biases shape our understanding of likelihood, risk, and uncertainty, aspects of reality that human intuition struggles to grasp accurately. In this domain, our natural cognitive tendencies often lead us astray in systematic and predictable ways, creating distorted perceptions of what might happen and how we should respond. As you move into the central chamber of the observatory, you find yourself surrounded by visual representations of probability, dice suspended in mid-roll, branching decision trees, bell curves, and statistical distributions floating like holograms. The entire space seems designed to make visible the normally abstract concepts of chance, risk, and uncertainty. Our first exploration here concerns availability bias, explains the voice. This is our tendency to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind rather than on objective statistical frequency. The more readily we can recall or imagine something, the more probable it seems, regardless of its actual frequency. Before you, the probability fields shift to demonstrate this bias in action. You see how vivid, recent, or emotionally charged events become disproportionately easy to recall, creating a distorted mental map of risk. A dramatic news story about a shark attack makes ocean swimming seem more dangerous than driving, despite the vastly higher statistical risk of the latter. A friend's story about winning the lottery makes gambling seem more likely to succeed than starting a small business, despite the overwhelming statistical evidence to the contrary. Availability bias occurs because your mind uses a simple rule. If something is easy to remember or imagine, it must be common, continues the voice. This mental shortcut, what psychologists call a heuristic, serves us reasonably well in many contexts. Things that happen frequently usually are easier to recall than rare events. But this heuristic becomes systematically misleading when memory accessibility is influenced by factors unrelated to frequency, such as emotional impact, recency, or media coverage. The display shows how our mental map of risk becomes warped. Fears of terrorism, plane crashes, and rare diseases loom large because of their vividness and emotional impact, while statistically greater risks, like heart disease, car accidents, or medication errors, seem less threatening despite their higher probability. You can see how this distortion affects decisions from personal health choices to public policy priorities, often leading to misallocation of concern and resources. What makes availability bias particularly powerful, notes the voice, is that mere exposure to discussions of a risk can increase its availability in memory, making it seem more probable. Simply reading news stories about a rare crime can make it seem like crime is increasing, even when statistical trends show the opposite. This creates feedback loops where media coverage influences risk perception, which creates demand for more coverage, further distorting perceived risk. As you contemplate the implications of this bias, the observatory chamber transitions to reveal another perspective on probability assessment. Here, the floating visualizations show not just probabilities themselves, but the confidence with which people estimate them. You notice a curious pattern. The confidence displays often show little relationship to actual accuracy, with some of the most confident predictions attached to the least reliable probability estimates. This chamber reveals overconfidence bias, explains the voice. This is our tendency to overestimate our knowledge, abilities, and the accuracy of our beliefs and forecasts. Research consistently shows that our confidence in our judgments often far exceeds their actual accuracy. We think we know more than we do, and can predict more than is actually possible. Before you, the display demonstrates different manifestations of this bias. In one visualization, people estimate with 90% confidence that a fact is true, yet such estimates prove correct only about 70% of the time. In another, experts make predictions about future events with high confidence, yet their success rate barely exceeds chance. In a third, individuals across various fields consistently rate their skills as above average, a statistical impossibility for the group as a whole. Overconfidence takes several forms, the voice continues. There's overestimation, thinking you're better at something than you actually are. There's overplacement, believing you're better than others when you're not. And there's overprecision, being too certain about the accuracy of your knowledge or predictions. All three forms stem from our mind's preference for certainty over doubt, and our tendency to focus on evidence that supports our abilities while discounting contrary indicators. You observe how overconfidence connects to biases you've already encountered, how confirmation bias leads us to focus on evidence supporting our existing beliefs, including beliefs about our own abilities, how self-serving bias attributes successes to our skills and failures to external factors, gradually inflating our self-assessment, how hindsight bias creates an illusion that we predicted outcomes better than we actually did, reinforcing confidence in our foresight. As you approach the marketplace, the soft crystalline tones gradually blend with the gentle murmur of human activity. Unlike ordinary marketplaces focused on the exchange of goods, this one appears dedicated to the exchange of ideas, impressions, and social judgments. Throughout the open plaza, you see people clustered in various configurations, some in tight-knit groups with similar appearances, others in more diverse gatherings, some engaged in animated conversation, while others seem to communicate through subtle gestures and expressions. "Welcome to the social marketplace," the voice greets you, now seeming to emerge from the collective hum of interaction rather than any single source. Here, we explore how cognitive biases shape not just individual thinking, but our social understanding, how we perceive, judge, and interact with others. These biases influence whom we trust, how we interpret others' actions, and the groups we form, often operating beneath the level of conscious awareness. As you enter the central plaza, you notice that the marketplace is organized into distinct regions, each highlighting different aspects of social cognition. In some areas, people cluster by similarity. In others, status hierarchies are visible. In still others, information seems to flow through networks with recognizable patterns of influence and authority. Our first exploration here concerns in-group bias, explains the voice. This is our tendency to favor members of groups we identify with, while viewing those outside these groups with greater suspicion or criticism. We extend greater trust, cooperation, and benefit of the doubt to our people, while often applying higher standards and harsher judgments to those perceived as other. Before you, the marketplace demonstrates this bias in action. You observe how people naturally cluster into groups based on visible similarities, appearance, dress, speech patterns, as well as less visible commonalities like shared values or experiences. Within these clusters, you notice greater warmth, trust, and cooperation, while interactions across group boundaries appear more cautious, formal, or sometimes tense. In-group bias emerges early in human development and appears across cultures, continues the voice. It served crucial evolutionary functions. In environments where resources were limited and danger common, quickly distinguishing ally from potential threat had survival value. Those who cooperated preferentially with reliable allies, often those who shared kinship or tribal membership, were more likely to survive and reproduce. The marketplace display shifts to show how contemporary forms of this ancient tendency manifest. From harmless preferences for hometown sports teams to troubling discrimination against those with different ethnicities, religions, or political affiliations. You observe how easily arbitrary distinctions can activate this bias. Even random assignment to meaningless groups in laboratory experiments triggers preferential treatment of teammates. What makes in-group bias particularly powerful, notes the voice, is how unconsciously it operates. Most people explicitly endorse fairness and reject prejudice, yet still demonstrate systematic favoritism toward their in-groups in judgments and behaviors. This disconnect between conscious values and unconscious tendencies creates both personal inconsistency and social friction. As you contemplate the implications of this bias, the marketplace displays shift to highlight another pattern of social perception. Now you observe how people form impressions of others based on minimal information. A single prominent trait, behavior, or characteristic coloring perception of everything else about the person. These initial impressions create expectations that influence what information is noticed subsequently, often in ways that reinforce the original judgment. This pattern reveals the halo effect and related impression formation biases, explains the voice. The halo effect occurs when one positive trait leads us to assume other positive qualities in a person. For instance, judging attractive people as more intelligent, talented, or moral without evidence for these connections. The reverse, sometimes called the horns effect, happens when one negative characteristic tarnishes our overall impression, leading us to assume other negative traits. The marketplace scenes now show these effects in everyday situations. A job candidate's confident demeanor creating an impression of competence that overshadows lack of relevant experience. A student's poor performance on one test leading a teacher to interpret ambiguous future work negatively. A celebrity's charitable actions creating a halo that shields them from criticism in unrelated areas. These impression biases create efficiency in social cognition, continues the voice. Rather than maintaining complex, contradictory impressions of each person we encounter, a potentially overwhelming cognitive load, our minds naturally organize perceptions into coherent patterns. But this efficiency comes at the cost of accuracy and nuance. We miss contradictory information, overlook situational factors influencing behavior, and maintain oversimplified views of others' personalities. You notice how these impression biases connect with other patterns you've already explored. How confirmation bias leads us to notice information that supports our initial impressions while overlooking contradictory evidence. How fundamental attribution error attributes others' behavior to their personality rather than their circumstances. How memory biases selectively preserve impression-consistent information. The marketplace now transitions to highlight how social judgments spread through communities. You observe information flowing through social networks, with some ideas rapidly gaining acceptance while others struggle for attention, regardless of their accuracy or value. Most notably, you see how similar beliefs cluster and intensify within groups, while differences between groups grow more pronounced over time. This section reveals group polarization and information cascades, explains the voice. Group polarization is the tendency for groups to make more extreme decisions than individuals would make alone, with groups of like-minded people typically moving toward more extreme versions of their shared inclinations through discussion. Information cascades occur when people follow others' judgments rather than relying on their own independent assessment, creating rapid spread of beliefs or behaviors through social influence. The marketplace display shows these phenomena unfolding. A community gradually adopting more extreme positions as moderate voices go silent or conform. Information spreading rapidly, based more on who shared it than its inherent credibility. Echo chambers forming, where similar viewpoints continually reinforce each other without meaningful exposure to alternatives. These social influence patterns served important functions in human evolution, continues the voice. Conforming to group judgment was often safer than relying solely on individual assessment, especially in uncertain situations. Following high-status individuals' lead could provide access to wisdom accumulated through experience. and group solidarity helped maintain the cohesion necessary for collective survival in challenging environments. You observe how these adaptive tendencies create challenges in modern contexts, where information environments allow for unprecedented filtering of exposure to diverse perspectives, where social media algorithms inadvertently create filter bubbles that intensify polarization, where the human tendency toward group conformity meets technologies designed to maximize engagement through emotional intensity rather than accuracy or nuance. What makes these social biases particularly significant, notes the voice, its tone growing gentler as your relaxation deepens, is how they interact to shape collective understanding. In-group bias leads us to trust our people more than outsiders. Impression formation biases create simplified judgments of both allies and opponents. Group polarization pushes communities toward extremes, while information cascades spread beliefs rapidly without independent verification. Together, these patterns can create shared realities within groups that diverge dramatically from those of other communities, all while each group remains convinced of the objectivity of their perception. The marketplace now reveals a final aspect of social cognition: the tendency to perceive agency, intention, and pattern where it may not exist. You observe people inferring complex motivations behind random events, detecting faces and figures in natural formations, and constructing elaborate explanations for coincidences. Most notably, you see how readily people perceive intentional coordination or conspiracy when facing threatening or confusing circumstances. This pattern reveals our tendency toward anthropomorphism, pareidolia, and conspiracy thinking, explains the voice. These related biases reflect our highly developed social intelligence being applied beyond its optimal domain, seeing minds, intentions, and coordinated agency even in non-human entities, random patterns, or uncoordinated events. Our minds evolved to understand other humans, so we readily apply this social template to making sense of our broader environment. The marketplace shows these tendencies in benign forms: naming cars and talking to plants, seeing faces in clouds or buildings, creating narratives to explain random market fluctuations, as well as more problematic manifestations, particularly how uncertainty and threat can trigger perception of malevolent coordination behind complex events with no single cause. These agency detection biases reflect an evolutionary asymmetry in the costs of different errors, continues the voice. For our ancestors, mistakenly detecting a predator or enemy that wasn't there, a false positive, was far less costly than failing to detect one that was present, a false negative. Those who erred on the side of perceiving intention and agency, even occasionally where none existed, were more likely to survive than those who missed actual threats. This created a bias towards seeing minds and intentions that persists in contemporary human cognition. As you absorb these insights about social cognition, you notice your body feels increasingly at ease, settled into a profound relaxation that doesn't diminish your ability to follow the journey, but removes any tension or effort from the experience. The collective murmur of the marketplace now seems to resonate with your breathing, creating a deeply soothing rhythm that enhances your tranquility. The social biases we've explored reflect something profound about human nature, the voice suggests, its cadence slowing to match your deepening calm. We are fundamentally social beings whose survival and flourishing have always depended on group cooperation, accurate assessment of others' intentions, and shared understanding of reality. Our cognitive tendencies reflect this evolutionary history, prioritizing social cohesion, quick judgment of friend versus foe, and coordination through shared belief, sometimes at the expense of strict accuracy or openness to difference. The entire marketplace gradually appears as an integrated ecosystem of social cognition, a complex interplay of tendencies that simultaneously enable the miracles of human cooperation and the persistent challenges of intergroup conflict, polarization, and collective delusion. This visual synthesis helps you appreciate how these biases work together to shape not just individual perception, but collective realities that become the taken for granted background of social life. As we prepare to leave the social marketplace, the voice says, notice how the biases we've explored so far in perception, memory, probability assessment, and social cognition all work together to construct your subjective reality. Each serves adaptive functions, but also creates predictable distortions in how you perceive the world and relate to others. Our journey will now take us toward biases that shape how we make decisions and judgments based on this constructed reality. The path from the marketplace leads toward what appears to be an ancient crossroads visible in the distance, a place where multiple paths converge. Decisions must be made, and the consequences of different choices become apparent. Here, you'll explore how cognitive biases shape not just how we construct reality, but how we make choices within it, influencing everything from everyday purchases to life-altering decisions about relationships, careers, and values. As you move along this path, the sounds of the marketplace gradually fade, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant sound of flowing water. These natural sounds synchronize with your breathing, deepening your relaxation while maintaining the perfect balance between restfulness and receptivity. The journey through the landscape of cognitive biases continues, each territory revealing another aspect of how your mind constructs and navigates the reality you experience. As you approach the ancient crossroads, its weathered stone markers and well-worn paths tell stories of countless decisions made by travelers before you. Unlike ordinary intersections designed simply for navigation, this one appears built for contemplation. Each path emanating from the central circle is lined with reflective pools and meditation benches where travelers can pause to consider their choices. In the center stands a monumental sundial, its shadow slowly tracking time's passage and subtly reminding visitors of the temporal context of every decision. Welcome to the crossroads of decision, the voice greets you, now seeming to emerge from the very ground beneath your feet. Here, we explore how cognitive biases influence not just how we perceive reality, but how we make choices within it. From minor daily selections to life-defining decisions. These biases shape our judgments in systematic ways, often without our awareness, creating patterns of decision-making that can either serve or undermine our deepest values and long-term interests. As you enter the central circle of the crossroads, you notice that the different paths leading away represent various life domains where decisions are made: career, relationships, health, finance, leisure, ethics. Along each path, decision points appear as smaller branchings, with transparent echoes of travelers making choices and experiencing their consequences. Our first exploration here concerns status quo bias, explains the voice. This is our tendency to prefer things to remain the same, perceiving change as a loss or threat, even when objective assessment might suggest otherwise. We disproportionately stick with current options, from daily routines to career paths to political systems, not necessarily because they're optimal, but because they're familiar. Before you, the crossroads demonstrates this bias in action. You observe how travelers approach decision points with a visible tilt toward continuing their current trajectory, even when alternative paths offer potentially greater benefits. The effort required to change direction appears visibly greater than the effort to continue forward, as though an invisible force, like gravity, pulls toward the maintenance of existing patterns. Status quo bias emerges from several psychological tendencies, continues the voice. Loss aversion makes potential downsides of change feel more significant than potential benefits. The endowment effect leads us to value what we already have more highly just because it's ours. Regret avoidance makes us fear the potential regret of a change that turns out poorly more than the regret of missing opportunities through inaction. And simple cognitive ease makes familiar options feel safer and more appealing than unfamiliar alternatives. The crossroads display shifts to show how this bias influences decisions across domains, from consumers sticking with default settings and subscription services rather than actively choosing alternatives, to employees remaining in unfulfilling jobs rather than pursuing more suitable opportunities, to societies maintaining problematic systems rather than undertaking potentially disruptive reforms. You notice how the bias operates most powerfully in conditions of complexity and uncertainty, where the comfort of the familiar becomes especially appealing. What makes status quo bias particularly significant, notes the voice, is how it interacts with the arbitrary nature of many status quo conditions. Often, what exists now resulted from historical accidents, temporary solutions that became permanent, or past constraints that no longer apply. Yet once established, these arrangements gain a powerful psychological advantage over alternatives, regardless of their actual merit relative to current needs and possibilities. As you contemplate this insight, the crossroads transforms to highlight another pattern of decision-making. Now, you observe how travelers' choices are strongly influenced by how options are presented or framed, rather than by their objective characteristics. Identical alternatives described differently elicit dramatically different responses, and the inclusion of irrelevant options systematically shifts preferences among relevant ones. This pattern reveals framing effects and context-dependent preferences, explains the voice. Framing effects occur when the same option is evaluated differently depending on how it's described, as a gain or loss, in positive or negative terms, or with different reference points. Context-dependent preferences emerge when our evaluation of options changes based on the presence of other alternatives, even when those alternatives aren't chosen. The crossroads now displays classic examples of these phenomena. Identical medical treatments framed as having 90% survival rates versus 10% mortality rates generate different choices. A moderately priced option becomes more attractive when placed between a budget and premium alternative than when presented alone. And removing an option from a set sometimes increases rather than decreases the appeal of remaining alternatives that shared features with the removed choice. These effects challenge traditional models of rational decision-making, continues the voice. They suggest that preferences aren't fixed properties we simply consult when making choices, but constructive processes happening in the moment, influenced by how options are presented, what alternatives are available, and what reference points are salient. Our decisions emerge not just from what we want, but from how we're thinking about our wants in specific decision contexts. You notice how these framing and context effects connect with biases you've already explored. How loss aversion makes us respond differently to identical outcomes framed as gains versus losses. How availability bias makes recently mentioned or easily imagined outcomes more influential in decisions. How social comparison shapes our evaluation of options based on what others choose rather than solely on the option's inherent qualities. The crossroads now transitions to reveal how decisions are influenced not just by how options are framed in the moment, but by the sequence of previous decisions. You observe travelers making choices that seem puzzling in isolation, but make sense when viewed as attempts to justify or remain consistent with earlier commitments, even when those initial commitments resulted from arbitrary or outdated considerations. This section reveals commitment bias and escalation of commitment, explains the voice. Commitment bias is our tendency to remain consistent with previous decisions, often rationalizing this consistency as principled rather than acknowledging when circumstances or information have changed. Escalation of commitment, sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy, occurs when we continue investing resources in endeavors primarily because of what we've already invested, rather than based on rational assessment of future prospects. The crossroads shows these phenomena unfolding across domains. Investors holding losing positions rather than accepting losses. Organizations continuing failing projects due to previous investments. Individuals maintaining relationships or careers that no longer serve them because of time already invested. And even nations persisting with failing policies because leaders have publicly committed to them and fear the political costs of changing course. These commitment biases served important functions in human evolution, continues the voice. Reputation for reliability and consistency facilitated trust and cooperation in small-scale societies where social memory was long. Following through on commitments despite short-term costs often yielded long-term social benefits, and persistence through difficulties sometimes revealed opportunities or solutions that wouldn't have emerged without sustained effort. You observe how these adaptive tendencies create challenges in modern contexts, where rapidly changing circumstances may require flexibility rather than consistency, where complex, high-stakes decisions benefit from clear-eyed assessment of future prospects regardless of past investments, and where public admission of changed views is often painted as flip-flopping rather than appropriate learning and adaptation. What makes these decision biases particularly consequential, notes the voice, its tone growing even gentler as your relaxation deepens, is how they can gradually lead us away from paths aligned with our deepest values. Small initial commitments, perhaps made with limited information or under social pressure, create trajectories that subsequent choices tend to follow and strengthen. Decision by decision, we may find ourselves living lives that made sense at each individual choice point, but don't reflect what we would have chosen with broader perspective. The entire crossroads now appears as an integrated system of decision influences, where status quo bias creates resistance to changing established patterns. Framing effects shape how options are evaluated in the moment, and commitment biases maintain consistency with previous choices regardless of changing circumstances. This visual synthesis helps you appreciate how these tendencies work together to create decision paths that have their own momentum, sometimes carrying us toward destinations we never consciously chose. These decision biases reveal something profound about human nature, the voice suggests, its cadence slowing to match your deepening tranquility. We aren't the purely rational agents that some economic and philosophical theories presume, carefully weighing options based on fixed preferences and acting to maximize utility. Nor are we merely impulsive creatures driven by immediate desires. Rather, we navigate a middle ground, using efficient cognitive shortcuts that generally serve us well, while sometimes leading to systematic errors or choices inconsistent with our broader values. As you absorb this perspective, the crossroads reveals a final aspect of decision-making: the curious disconnect between how we predict decisions will affect our well-being and how they actually impact our lived experience. You observe travelers making choices based on forecasts about future happiness that often prove inaccurate, systematically overestimating the emotional impact of both positive and negative outcomes, while underestimating their ability to adapt to new circumstances. This pattern reveals impact bias and related errors in effective forecasting, explains the voice. Impact bias is our tendency to overestimate the intensity and duration of our emotional reactions to future events. We predict that positive outcomes, a promotion, a new relationship, a material acquisition, will bring more lasting happiness than they typically do. Similarly, we expect negative events, a rejection, a loss, a disappointment, to hurt more persistently than they usually do. The crossroads shows how these forecasting errors influence decisions. Individuals sacrifice present well-being for achievements that bring less satisfaction than anticipated. Consumers make purchases expected to deliver lasting happiness that quickly fades. People avoid necessary but potentially painful choices, like ending unhealthy relationships, because they overestimate how badly they'll feel afterward. And societies focus on increasing metrics, like wealth, that correlate less strongly with well-being than expected. These forecasting errors occur for several reasons, continues the voice. We focus too narrowly on the target event when making predictions, neglecting how other aspects of life will continue to influence our emotions. We underestimate our remarkable psychological immune system, our capacity to rationalize and find meaning in almost any circumstance. And we fail to account for hedonic adaptation, our tendency to return to baseline happiness levels after both positive and negative changes in circumstances. As you contemplate the implications of these forecasting biases, you notice your body has settled into profound relaxation. Your breathing has found its natural rhythm, deep and even. The crossroads around you seems to pulse gently with this same rhythm, creating a deeply soothing synchronization between your physiological state and the environment of your journey. As we prepare to leave the crossroads, the voice says, consider how the biases we've explored so far work together to construct and navigate your reality. Perception biases filter what information you notice. Memory biases shape how you reconstruct the past. Probability biases influence how you assess risks and possibilities. Social biases guide how you understand others and form groups. And decision biases affect the choices you make based on this constructed understanding. Together, these patterns create the subjective reality you experience as self-evident truth. The path from the crossroads leads toward what appears to be an ancient temple, partially obscured by mist in the distance, a structure dedicated not to any deity, but to the exploration of meaning and narrative. Here, you'll discover how cognitive biases shape not just isolated perceptions and decisions, but the overarching stories we create to make sense of ourselves and the world. The narratives that give coherence and purpose to our lives, while sometimes blinding us to alternative interpretations of our experience. As you approach the ancient temple, its architecture becomes clearer through the thinning mist. Unlike temples dedicated to particular deities, this structure appears designed to honor the human capacity for meaning-making itself. Intricate carvings along its columns depict people in various stages of storytelling, some recording events, others interpreting patterns, still others sharing narratives with rapt listeners. The entrance consists of multiple doorways, each framing a different perspective on the same interior space, symbolizing how a single reality can be perceived through countless narrative lenses. "Welcome to the Temple of Narrative," the voice greets you, now resonating with the acoustic properties of the temple space. Here, we explore how cognitive biases shape not just isolated perceptions and decisions, but the overarching stories we create to make sense of our lives and the world. These narrative biases influence how we construct meaning, interpret causality, and maintain coherent identities, often prioritizing coherence and significance over strict accuracy. As you enter the central chamber of the temple, you find yourself surrounded by what appear to be living stories, dynamic three-dimensional scenes showing events unfolding while simultaneously revealing the narrative structures people impose upon them. Some events appear connected by glowing strands representing perceived causality. Others are highlighted or diminished based on their alignment with existing story frameworks. And throughout, you notice how the same occurrences take on dramatically different meanings depending on the narrative context in which they're placed. Our first exploration here concerns narrative bias itself, explains the voice. This is our fundamental tendency to perceive reality in terms of stories, with protagonists, motivations, causes and effects, meaningful arcs, and resolving outcomes, rather than as disconnected events or complex systems with multiple interacting factors. We naturally organize experience into narrative form, even when doing so requires significant simplification or distortion of what actually occurred. Before you, the temple demonstrates this bias in action. You observe how people transform complex, multifaceted situations into streamlined narratives with clear protagonists, antagonists, and causal links. A company's success becomes the story of a visionary CEO rather than countless contributing factors, including timing, market conditions, and collective effort. A social movement is reduced to the influence of a few key figures rather than emerging from complex social dynamics. Personal success or failure is attributed to individual character and choices rather than the interplay of effort, circumstance, privilege, and chance. Narrative bias emerges from our need to make sense of complexity, continues the voice. Stories provide cognitive efficiency. They compress information into memorable, meaningful patterns. They offer emotional resolution, transforming confusing or troubling events into coherent accounts with moral significance. And they facilitate social transmission. Packaging experience in forms easily shared with others. In environments where understanding causes and sharing knowledge conferred survival advantages, the capacity to create and understand narratives became deeply embedded in human cognition. The temple display shifts to show how this bias influences interpretations across domains, from individuals constructing life stories that emphasize agency and coherence while downplaying randomness and contradiction, to organizations creating founding myths that justify current practices, to societies developing historical narratives that support existing power structures and collective identities. You notice how these narrative constructions aren't typically experienced as interpretations, but as reality itself, the water in which we swim, unnoticed precisely because it surrounds us completely. What makes narrative bias particularly powerful, notes the voice, is how it transforms the abstract into the concrete and personal. Statistics, trends, and systems thinking rarely evoke the emotional engagement that stories generate. A single vivid anecdote can overshadow mountains of contradictory data. A compelling personal narrative can seem more true than careful analysis of complex causality. This emotional power gave narratives survival value in human evolution, but creates vulnerability to manipulation in information environments where compelling stories can be crafted to serve particular interests. As you contemplate this insight, the temple transforms to highlight another aspect of narrative construction. Now, you observe how people selectively perceive, interpret, and remember information in ways that maintain a coherent sense of self. Seeing themselves as generally consistent, competent, and moral agents, even when evidence might suggest more complex or less flattering realities. This pattern reveals self-serving and self-consistency biases in personal narrative, explains the voice. We construct and maintain identities that feel coherent and positive, often through selective attention, biased interpretation, and creative memory. When faced with evidence challenging our self-concept, we typically find ways to incorporate or explain this information that preserves our established sense of self rather than fundamentally revising it. The temple now displays how these biases shape autobiography. You see how people reinterpret past actions to align with current values rather than acknowledging genuine change. How they take credit for successes while attributing failures to circumstances. How they remember their predictions as more accurate than they were, and how they reconcile contradictory behaviors by developing more complex self-theories rather than recognizing fundamental inconsistency. These self-narrative biases served important psychological functions, continues the voice. A stable, positive sense of self supports psychological well-being and effective action in the world. Excessive self-doubt or identity fragmentation can lead to depression, anxiety, and difficulty sustaining goal-directed behavior. So while these biases may sometimes distort reality, they also provide the foundation for the coherent identity needed to navigate life effectively. You notice how these self-narrative biases connect with others you've already explored. How confirmation bias leads us to notice information supporting our self-concept while overlooking contradictory evidence. How self-serving bias attributes positive outcomes to our character and negative ones to circumstances. How hindsight bias creates an illusion that we anticipated events better than we did, supporting a sense of competence and control. The temple now transitions to reveal how narrative biases shape our interpretation of causality itself. You observe people detecting patterns in random sequences, perceiving intentional action where none exists, and constructing explanations that impose simplicity and meaning on complex or indeterminate situations. This section reveals apophenia, anthropomorphism, and the need for closure, explains the voice. Apophenia is our tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data, seeing faces in clouds, messages in coincidences, or trends in random fluctuations. Anthropomorphism involves attributing human-like intentions and motivations to non-human entities or systems, and the need for closure drives us to formulate explanations, even when evidence is limited, rather than sustaining uncertainty or ambiguity. The temple shows these tendencies manifesting across domains, investors detecting patterns in market movements that are largely random, individuals perceiving personal messages in ordinary coincidences, conspiracy theorists connecting unrelated events into coherent narratives, people attributing intentions to weather systems or mechanical failures, and widespread preference for incorrect explanations over acknowledging the limits of understanding. These narrative tendencies reflect our profound discomfort with randomness, meaninglessness, and uncertainty, continues the voice. Humans evolved to detect patterns, infer intentions, and construct explanations, capacities that often served us well, but can lead us astray in a complex world where many events result from random processes, emergent systems beyond individual control, or multiple interacting factors rather than simple causes and effects. You observe how these explanation biases connect to the broader pattern of narrative biases, our minds continuously working to transform the messy complexity of reality into coherent stories with clear causes, meaningful significance, and moral implications. This narrative impulse brings order to chaos and meaning to randomness, but sometimes at the cost of oversimplification or outright distortion. What makes these narrative biases particularly consequential, notes the voice, its tone growing even gentler as your relaxation deepens, is how they shape not just how we interpret past events, but our very sense of what's possible in the future. The stories we tell about ourselves, others, and the world create lenses through which we perceive new information and frameworks that guide future action. Narrative doesn't just explain reality, it helps create it through its influence on perception, interpretation, memory, and choice. The entire temple now appears as an integrated system of narrative construction, where selective perception filters information, causal attribution creates meaningful connections, memory reconstruction supports coherent story arcs, and emotional need shape, which narratives feel compelling or true. This visual synthesis helps you appreciate how these tendencies work together to create the storied realities we inhabit, which feel like objective truth, but are inevitably shaped by these narrative processes. These narrative biases reveal something profound about human cognition, the voice suggests, its cadence slowing to match your deepening tranquility. We are fundamentally meaning-making creatures, compelled to transform the raw material of experience into coherent narratives that explain the past, guide the present, and anticipate the future. This narrative capacity allows us to learn from experience, coordinate with others, and maintain the coherent identities necessary for effective action. Yet, it also creates systematic distortions in how we understand ourselves and the world, simplifying complexity, imposing pattern on randomness, and maintaining cherished beliefs, even when evidence might suggest revision. As you absorb this perspective, your awareness of your physical body begins to fade slightly, while your engagement with the journey maintains a perfect balance between receptivity and restfulness. The temple's ambient sounds, distant chanting, the gentle ring of ceremonial bells, the whisper of ancient scrolls being unfolded, create a deeply soothing soundscape that enhances your tranquil state. As we prepare to leave the temple, the voice says, consider how the narrative biases we've explored work together with the other cognitive tendencies you've discovered on this journey. Together, they reveal the constructed nature of human reality, how what we experience as self-evident truth is actually shaped by these invisible cognitive processes. This understanding doesn't eliminate these biases, but it offers a kind of freedom, the capacity to hold our constructions more lightly, to consider alternative interpretations, and to remember that the map is not the territory. The path from the temple leads toward what appears to be a serene mountain landscape in the distance, where perception widens to encompass broader perspectives while recognizing the limitations inherent in any single viewpoint. Here, you'll explore the metacognitive dimension of bias, how awareness of our cognitive tendencies creates possibilities for more flexible, nuanced engagement with reality, even as these biases continue to operate. As you move along this path, the temple's sounds gradually blend with the natural melody of wind through mountain passes and distant streams. These harmonious sounds synchronize perfectly with your breathing, deepening your relaxation while maintaining the ideal balance between consciousness and dreaming. The journey through the landscape of cognitive biases continues, moving now toward perspectives that integrate and transcend the patterns you've explored, while acknowledging their continued influence on human perception and understanding. As you approach the mountain range, its majestic peaks emerge more clearly through thinning mist. Unlike ordinary mountains that simply exist as geological features, these seem designed specifically for perspective taking, their paths spiraling gradually upward to provide continuously changing viewpoints, plateaus positioned to reveal new aspects of the landscape below, and occasional clearings where multiple observers can gather to share different perspectives on the same vista. The air grows cooler and clearer as you begin your ascent, bringing a refreshing quality to each breath. Welcome to the mountain of perspective, the voice greets you, now seeming to emerge from the mountain air itself. Here, we explore metacognitive biases, the patterns that influence how we think about our own thinking. These biases shape our awareness of our cognitive processes, our assessment of our knowledge and abilities, and our capacity to recognize limitations in our understanding. They represent a higher order of cognitive tendencies that affect not just what we think, but how we think about our thinking. As you begin ascending the gentle path that winds up the mountainside, you notice that each turn reveals a slightly different view of the territories you've already traversed. The Garden of Perception, the Hall of Mirrors, the Memory Archive, the Observatory of Probability, the Social Marketplace, the Crossroads of Decision, and the Temple of Narrative. These changing perspectives help you appreciate how the same cognitive landscapes can appear dramatically different depending on one's vantage point. Our first exploration here concerns the illusion of explanatory depth, explains the voice. This is our tendency to believe we understand concepts, mechanisms, or systems much more thoroughly than we actually do. We confuse familiarity with comprehension, assuming that because something feels known to us, we genuinely understand how it works at a deeper level. Before you, the mountain path reveals a series of transparent figures engaged with various objects and systems: bicycles, zippers, toilets, economies, political systems, natural ecosystems. Initially, these figures display confidence in their understanding, but when asked to explain precisely how these things work or why they hold certain beliefs about them, their explanations reveal substantial gaps and uncertainties. You observe their surprise and sometimes discomfort as they recognize the limits of their comprehension. This illusion occurs because we often mistake recognition for understanding, continues the voice. We confuse our ability to identify something, use it successfully, or discuss it in general terms with genuine comprehension of its mechanisms or principles. Additionally, we exist in a division of knowledge society where we can successfully navigate complex systems without personally understanding them. We know how to use smartphones without comprehending their engineering, participate in economies without grasping monetary policy, and benefit from medical treatments without understanding biochemistry. The mountain display shifts to show how this illusion influences judgments across domains. From consumers confidently comparing technical products they don't truly understand, to voters holding strong opinions about policies whose details and implications they couldn't explain, to individuals making health decisions based on superficial understanding of bodily systems. You notice how this illusory confidence can make us less likely to seek deeper knowledge or defer to genuine expertise when appropriate. What makes the illusion of explanatory depth particularly significant, notes the voice, is how it affects our collective decision-making about complex systems. When we overestimate our understanding of climate science, economic policy, public health measures, or technological impacts, we may support overly simplistic solutions to complex problems or reject expert guidance based on the false belief that our intuitive understanding is sufficient. As you contemplate this insight, the mountain path curves around a ridge to reveal another aspect of metacognitive bias. Now, you observe people assessing their own knowledge, abilities, and performance compared to others. Strikingly, you notice a systematic pattern where most individuals rate themselves as above average across various domains, a statistical impossibility for the group as a whole. This pattern reveals the Dunning-Kruger effect and related superiority biases, explains the voice. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how people with low ability in a domain tend to overestimate their competence because they lack the very knowledge needed to recognize their limitations. Meanwhile, the illusory superiority bias leads most people to rate themselves as better than average across many traits and abilities, from driving skill to ethical character to professional competence. The mountain now displays these effects across different skill levels. Novices confidently overestimating their abilities while remaining unaware of what they don't know. Intermediates developing more accurate self-assessment as they learn enough to recognize their limitations. And experts sometimes underestimating their exceptional abilities because they're acutely aware of the complexity of their domain and what remains beyond their mastery. These metacognitive biases stem from several sources, continues the voice. We have limited access to information about others' internal experiences and performance, so we use ourselves as the primary reference point for judgment. We're motivated to maintain positive self-concepts, leading us to notice and emphasize evidence of our competence while discounting contradictory information. And in many domains, we lack clear, objective feedback that would allow more accurate calibration of our self-assessments. You notice how these superiority biases connect with others you've already explored. How confirmation bias leads us to notice evidence supporting positive self-assessments while overlooking contrary indicators. How self-serving bias attributes successes to our abilities and failures to circumstances. How social comparison biases lead us to select favorable reference groups or dimensions for comparison when evaluating ourselves. The mountain path now ascends to a plateau where you can observe people engaging with complex information and forming judgments. You notice a curious pattern. Once individuals form an initial impression or adopt a perspective, they tend to express greater certainty in their judgment than is warranted by the available evidence. Moreover, when presented with the same evidence but framed to support a different conclusion, they tend to identify flaws and limitations more readily. This plateau reveals belief perseverance and motivated skepticism, explains the voice. Belief perseverance is our tendency to maintain beliefs even when the evidence that initially supported them is thoroughly discredited. Motivated skepticism describes how we apply different standards of evaluation to information depending on whether it supports or challenges our existing views, scrutinizing challenging information more critically while accepting supporting information with less examination. The mountain shows these tendencies manifesting across contexts. Scientists holding onto theories despite mounting contradictory evidence, political partisans dismissing identical policy proposals when attributed to the opposing party, consumers maintaining brand loyalty despite declining quality, and individuals across domains applying rigorous skepticism to information, challenging their views while accepting confirming information with minimal scrutiny. These metacognitive biases reveal how our thinking resists revision, even as we believe ourselves to be rational and open-minded, continues the voice. Once beliefs become part of our understanding, they transform from conclusions into premises, becoming the foundation for further thinking rather than provisional positions subject to ongoing evaluation. This cognitive inertia served valuable functions in stable environments where rapid belief revision might lead to dangerous inconsistency, but creates challenges in contexts where adaptability to new information is crucial. You observe how belief perseverance connects to narrative biases you explored earlier. Our minds working to maintain coherent stories about ourselves and the world, sometimes at the expense of accurately integrating new information that would require substantial revision of these established narratives. What makes these metacognitive biases particularly consequential, notes the voice, its tone growing gentler as your ascent brings you to thinner air that somehow deepens your relaxation, is how they create blind spots in our awareness. We don't just hold mistaken beliefs. We're often unaware of the limits of our understanding, the flaws in our reasoning, and the biases influencing our judgments. This metacognitive blindness makes it especially difficult to correct for cognitive biases through mere intention or effort. The mountain path now reaches a remarkable viewpoint where you can observe a panorama of all the cognitive biases you've explored on your journey. From this elevated perspective, you can see how these various tendencies interact and reinforce each other. Confirmation bias supporting belief perseverance, availability bias influencing risk assessment, self-serving bias maintaining positive self-narrative, and framing effects shaping how options are evaluated. This integrated view helps you appreciate how these biases form an interconnected ecology of mind rather than isolated phenomena. These metacognitive insights reveal something profound about human cognition, the voice suggests, its cadence slowing to match the peaceful rhythm of your breathing at this elevation. Our minds didn't evolve primarily for perfect accuracy or consistent rationality, but for effective action in ancestral environments where certain kinds of errors were more costly than others. Understanding these biases doesn't mean we can simply eliminate them through awareness or intention. They're built into the architecture of cognition itself. But metacognitive understanding does create possibilities for developing systems, practices, and communities that can help compensate for these tendencies. As you absorb this perspective, the mountain air seems to become even clearer and more refreshing with each breath. Your body feels simultaneously lighter and more settled, while your mind maintains perfect receptivity without effort. The panoramic view from this elevation creates a sense of spaciousness that encompasses all you've learned while opening to what remains to be discovered. As we continue our ascent, the voice says, consider how the metacognitive biases we've explored offer both humbling and liberating insights. Humbling because they reveal fundamental limitations in human rationality that can't be eliminated through mere awareness or intention. Liberating because understanding these patterns allows us to hold our certainties more lightly, remain open to correction, and develop practices that help compensate for these tendencies. The path now leads toward an even higher ridge, where stone seats have been arranged in a semicircle, facing outward toward the vast landscape below. This contemplation area appears designed for integrating the insights from your journey, a place where the specific biases you've explored can be understood within broader patterns of human cognition and their implications for both individual understanding and collective wisdom. As you move toward this integration point, the mountain breeze carries hints of alpine flowers, their delicate fragrance creating a subtle olfactory dimension to your experience that further enhances your relaxed attentiveness. The sound of distant water, perhaps a high mountain stream or waterfall, adds a soothing auditory backdrop to your continued ascent. The journey through the landscape of cognitive biases approaches a culminating perspective, where the countless details of specific tendencies resolve into deeper patterns that offer wisdom about the nature of mind itself. As you reach the semicircle of stone seats, the full panorama of your journey unfolds beneath you with extraordinary clarity. From this elevated vantage point, the territories you've traversed, the garden of perception, the hall of mirrors, the memory archive, the observatory of probability, the social marketplace, the crossroads of decision, the temple of narrative, and the lower slopes of the mountain itself appear not as separate domains, but as an integrated landscape of mind. The connections between these regions become visible as luminous pathways, revealing how biases in one domain naturally flow into and reinforce those in others. Welcome to the summit of integration, the voice greets you, now seeming to emerge from the mountain itself and the vast sky above. Here, we explore how the cognitive biases you've encountered throughout your journey work together as an interconnected system, shaping your reality not through isolated effects, but through dynamic patterns of influence that flow across domains of thought. From this perspective, we can discern deeper principles underlying the specific biases you've explored. As you take a seat on one of the ancient stone benches, the air around you seems to crystallize into perfect stillness. The panoramic view becomes not just something you observe, but a living map that responds to your attention, highlighting different patterns and relationships as your focus shifts among them. This responsive visualization helps you perceive the larger architecture of cognitive bias beyond its specific manifestations. Our first integration reveals what we might call the efficiency principle, explains the voice. Many cognitive biases emerge from the mind's fundamental need to process vast amounts of information quickly using limited resources. These efficiency-serving biases create mental shortcuts that generally work well enough in most contexts, but can lead to systematic errors in specific situations where their underlying assumptions don't apply. Before you, the landscape illuminates to show how different biases serve this efficiency function across domains. Availability bias, using ease of recall as a proxy for probability. Confirmation bias, prioritizing information that fits existing models rather than processing everything equally. Stereotyping, applying group-level generalizations to individuals rather than processing each person's unique characteristics, and heuristic decision-making, using simple rules rather than comprehensive analysis. This efficiency orientation made perfect evolutionary sense, continues the voice. In ancestral environments, being able to make quick, good enough judgments often conferred greater survival and reproductive advantages than perfect but slow assessment. A mind that required comprehensive information and exhaustive analysis before reaching conclusions would have been poorly adapted to environments where threats and opportunities required rapid response. These cognitive shortcuts essentially trade accuracy for speed and efficiency in ways that typically served our ancestors well. The visualization shifts to show how modern contexts can sometimes amplify the costs of these efficiency-oriented biases. Information environments saturated with emotionally triggering content, distorting risk perception through availability bias. Digital filter bubbles, strengthening confirmation bias by presenting primarily reinforcing viewpoints. Media representations, reinforcing stereotypes that are then applied to individuals. And complex modern decisions involving factors our intuitive heuristics weren't designed to accommodate. What makes this efficiency principle significant, notes the voice, is how it reminds us that cognitive biases aren't design flaws but adaptations, mental shortcuts that evolved to solve specific problems faced by our ancestors. Understanding this helps us approach biases not as failures to be eliminated, but as specialized tools that serve valuable functions in appropriate contexts while creating predictable distortions when applied beyond their optimal domains. As you contemplate this insight, the summit's perspective shifts to highlight another integrative pattern. Now you observe how various biases work together to maintain psychological stability, preserving coherent self-concepts, manageable emotional states, and bearable levels of uncertainty despite potentially destabilizing information or experiences. This second integration reveals what we might call the stability principle, explains the voice. Many cognitive biases function to maintain psychological equilibrium, protecting us from information that might threaten our identity, trigger excessive negative emotion, or create paralyzing uncertainty. These stability-serving biases filter and interpret experience in ways that support coherent self-narrative, emotional regulation, and sufficient confidence for action. The panoramic view demonstrates how different biases serve this stability function across domains. Self-serving bias, attributing successes to our qualities and failures to circumstances, preserving positive self-concept. Cognitive dissonance reduction, reinterpreting contradictory information to maintain consistency. Defensive attribution, blaming victims of misfortune to preserve feelings of personal invulnerability. And belief, perseverance, maintaining established understandings even when challenged by contradictory evidence. These stability-oriented biases also served important evolutionary functions, continues the voice. Individuals with stable self-concepts, manageable emotional states, and sufficient confidence were likely better able to maintain effective action in challenging circumstances than those paralyzed by self-doubt, overwhelming emotion, or crippling uncertainty. Psychological stability creates a foundation for effective functioning, even if sometimes achieved through selective perception or creative interpretation rather than perfectly accurate assessment. The visualization now shows how modern contexts can sometimes amplify the costs of these stability-oriented biases. Social media presenting idealized representations of others that trigger destabilizing social comparison, which self-serving biases then work to counteract. Political polarization intensified by the need to maintain consistent worldviews despite complex, contradictory information. Moral judgments distorted by the desire to believe in a just world, and resistance to changing even harmful behaviors due to the threat of identity disruption. What makes this stability principle particularly consequential, notes the voice, is how it reminds us that accurate perception sometimes competes with psychological needs for coherence, manageable emotion, and actionable certainty. When information threatens important beliefs or identities, our minds often prioritize stability over accuracy, not because we're irrational, but because psychological coherence serves crucial functions for human flourishing, sometimes at the expense of perfect fidelity to reality. As you absorb this perspective, your awareness of your physical body becomes increasingly subtle. You feel neither heavy nor light, but perfectly balanced, present without effort, attentive without strain. The mountain air seems to nourish you directly, each breath deepening your tranquility while maintaining perfect clarity of perception and understanding. The summit's integrative view now shifts once more to highlight a third pattern connecting diverse biases. You observe how various cognitive tendencies work together to maintain social connection, facilitating group cohesion, coordination, and cooperation through shared perception and understanding, sometimes at the expense of objective accuracy. This third integration reveals what we might call the social cohesion principle, explains the voice. Many cognitive biases function to align our perceptions, beliefs, and judgments with those of our social groups, creating shared realities that enable coordination and cooperation. These cohesion-serving biases attune our thinking to social norms and group beliefs, sometimes prioritizing consensus over accuracy. The panoramic visualization demonstrates how different biases serve this social function across domains. Conformity bias, adjusting perceptions and judgments to match group norms. In-group bias, extending greater trust and charity to those sharing group membership. Authority bias, giving disproportionate weight to perspectives from high-status individuals. And shared information bias, focusing group discussions on already common knowledge rather than unique perspectives that might create conflict or confusion. These socially oriented biases served crucial evolutionary functions, continues the voice. Humans survived and thrived primarily through group cooperation, which requires sufficient alignment in perception and understanding to enable coordinated action. Individuals whose cognitive tendencies facilitated social integration likely enjoyed significant advantages over those whose perfectly accurate but idiosyncratic perceptions left them isolated or in constant conflict with their communities. The visualization shifts to show how modern contexts can amplify both benefits and costs of these socially oriented biases. Digital technologies enabling unprecedented coordination among widely distributed individuals sharing common understanding, but also creating filter bubbles and echo chambers where inaccurate beliefs amplify without external correction. Professional fields, developing specialized shared understandings that enable remarkable collaboration, but sometimes resist outside perspectives. And political polarization intensifying as different groups construct increasingly divergent interpretations of the same events. What makes this social cohesion principle especially significant, notes the voice, is how it highlights the fundamentally social nature of human cognition. Our minds didn't evolve primarily to represent reality with perfect accuracy, but to enable effective coordination with others. Understanding this social dimension helps explain why simply presenting contradictory facts often fails to change minds. Beliefs aren't just representations of reality, but components of social identity and belonging. The summit's perspective now expands to show how these three principles, efficiency, stability, and social cohesion, work together as an integrated system. You observe how biases serving different functions can either reinforce or sometimes conflict with each other. Efficiency-oriented shortcuts reinforcing stability when they filter out potentially destabilizing information. Social alignment sometimes creating tension with psychological stability when group norms conflict with personal needs. And the drive for efficiency occasionally undermining social cohesion when quick judgments bypass socially important considerations. These integrative principles, the voice suggests, its tone growing increasingly gentle as your relaxation deepens, offer a more nuanced understanding of cognitive biases than viewing them simply as errors or flaws. They reveal how these tendencies emerge from fundamental aspects of human nature: our need to process vast information with limited resources, maintain psychological coherence amid complexity and challenge, and coordinate effectively with others to survive and flourish. These needs sometimes compete with perfect accuracy, but serve crucial functions in human life. As you absorb this perspective, the summit's view expands once more to reveal a final integrative insight. Now you observe how awareness of these patterns creates new possibilities, not for eliminating biases, which remain built into the architecture of cognition, but for working more skillfully with them through metacognitive practices, institutional designs, and social processes that help compensate for their limitations while preserving their benefits. This final integration reveals what we might call the awareness principle, explains the voice. While cognitive biases cannot be eliminated through mere awareness or intention, as they operate largely through automatic processes beyond conscious control, understanding these patterns creates possibilities for developing compensatory practices and systems. The very capacity to recognize these tendencies represents a uniquely human form of metacognition that allows us to work more skillfully with the minds we have, rather than imagining we can redesign them from scratch. The panoramic view now shows various approaches to working constructively with biases. Individuals developing practices of intellectual humility and perspective taking that help moderate overconfidence and myopia. Organizations implementing decision processes that diversify viewpoints and create space for dissent. Research communities using methodologies like pre-registration and blind review to counteract confirmation and publication biases. And technologies designed to present information in ways that work with, rather than against cognitive tendencies. What makes this awareness principle particularly hopeful, notes the voice, is how it points toward practical wisdom rather than either naive optimism about rational perfectibility or cynical resignation to irrationality. It suggests that while we cannot eliminate cognitive biases through mere awareness, we can develop practices, institutions, and communities that help us navigate with greater wisdom, not by eliminating these tendencies, but by creating contexts that help compensate for their limitations while preserving their benefits. As this integrative perspective settles into your awareness, you notice that the summit has transformed around you. The stone seats now form a complete circle rather than a semicircle, and at the center burns a gentle flame representing the illumination that comes from understanding the patterns of mind. This transformation suggests that the journey of insight doesn't end with these recognitions, but continues as an ongoing practice of bringing awareness to how your mind constructs reality. As we prepare to begin our descent from this summit, the voice says, carry with you this integrated understanding of cognitive biases, not as isolated flaws, but as interconnected tendencies emerging from fundamental aspects of human nature. This perspective doesn't eliminate these biases, but offers a kind of freedom, the ability to hold your constructions with greater awareness, to recognize when efficiency, stability, or social alignment might be shaping your perception, and to cultivate practices that help you navigate with greater wisdom. The path leading downward from the summit appears before you, winding gently through alpine meadows where various contemplative practices are visible. People engaged in meditation, dialogue, writing, and other activities that cultivate metacognitive awareness. This descent will take you toward integrating the abstract understanding you've gained with practical approaches to living wisely with the mind you have. Rather than imagining you can eliminate its evolved tendencies through mere awareness or effort. As you rise from the stone seat to begin this descent, you notice your body feels simultaneously relaxed and energized, a perfect balance that requires no effort to maintain. The mountain air continues to nourish you with each breath, creating a profound sense of peace that doesn't diminish the clarity of your understanding, but rather provides the perfect foundation for it. The journey continues toward practical wisdom, each step revealing how abstract insight can be embodied in lived experience. As you descend from the summit along a gently winding path, the rocky terrain gradually gives way to a sprawling alpine meadow dotted with colorful wildflowers. Unlike ordinary meadows that merely exist as natural features, this one appears designed specifically for contemplative practice, with small clearings for solitary reflection, gathering spaces for dialogue, flowing streams perfect for mindful observation, and countless natural features that invite deeper awareness of both external reality and internal processes. Welcome to the meadow of practice, the voice greets you, now seeming to emerge from the very earth beneath your feet. Here, we explore how awareness of cognitive biases translates into practical wisdom, not through eliminating these tendencies, which remain built into the architecture of cognition, but through developing practices that help us work more skillfully with the minds we have. These approaches don't override biases, but create conditions that moderate their influence and expand our capacity to perceive beyond their limitations. As you walk along meadow paths, you notice people engaged in various contemplative practices throughout the landscape. Some sit in meditation, developing present moment awareness that helps create space between immediate reactions and responses. Others engage in structured dialogue, exploring different perspectives on shared questions with curiosity rather than debate. Still others practice writing exercises that make thinking processes explicit, revealing assumptions and patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. Our first exploration here concerns mindfulness and metacognitive awareness, explains the voice. These related practices involve developing the capacity to observe your own mental processes with non-judgmental attention, noticing thoughts, feelings, and perceptions as they arise, rather than automatically identifying with or acting upon them. This witnessing capacity creates a crucial space between stimulus and response, between the automatic operations of biases and your actions based upon them. Before you, the meadow demonstrates this practice in action. You observe people engaged in various forms of mindfulness, some through formal meditation, others through activities like mindful walking, eating, or listening. In each case, you notice how the practice cultivates awareness of mental processes that typically operate automatically and outside consciousness, the very level where cognitive biases exert their influence. Mindfulness doesn't eliminate biases, continues the voice. Your mind will continue generating automatic judgments, selectively attending to information, constructing coherent narratives, and making intuitive assessments based on limited data. But metacognitive awareness allows you to notice these operations rather than simply being operated by them. This noticing creates possibilities for choice. The ability to ask whether a particular reaction serves your deeper values and intentions, or primarily reflects cognitive habits shaped for a different time and purpose. The meta display shifts to show how this awareness practice influences responses across domains. A person noticing the emotional pull of sunk costs in a business decision and pausing to consider whether continuing investment truly makes sense. Someone recognizing how a politician's framing of an issue triggers automatic agreement based on group identity rather than careful consideration of the policy itself. A partner in conflict becoming aware of fundamental attribution error as they start to attribute their loved one's behavior to character flaws rather than circumstances. What makes mindfulness particularly valuable, notes the voice, is how it works with rather than against the nature of mind. It doesn't require eliminating automatic processes, an impossible task, but develops the capacity to notice these processes as they operate. This noticing doesn't happen through judgment or resistance, but through interested, compassionate attention that gradually reveals patterns without attempting to force immediate change. As you contemplate this insight, your path through the meadow leads to a clearing where people engage in various forms of structured dialogue. Unlike ordinary conversation focused on persuasion or simple information exchange, these dialogues appear designed specifically to expand perspective, using particular practices to help participants become aware of assumptions, explore different viewpoints, and develop more nuanced understanding of complex issues. This clearing reveals perspective-taking and dialogical practices, explains the voice. These approaches recognize that individual cognition is inevitably limited by personal experience, cultural context, and the cognitive biases we've explored throughout your journey. Rather than attempting to overcome these limitations through individual effort alone, these practices leverage the diversity of human perspective through structured interaction designed to reveal blind spots and expand understanding. The meadow now displays different dialogical approaches in action. People practicing steel manning by articulating opposing views in their strongest form rather than attacking weakened versions. Groups using structured turn-taking that ensures diverse perspectives are heard rather than dominated by the most confident voices. Facilitators helping participants identify shared values beneath apparent disagreements, and contemplative techniques that create space for deeper listening beyond immediate reaction. These perspective-expanding practices address a fundamental insight about human cognition, continues the voice. Our minds didn't evolve to perceive reality with perfect objectivity, but to construct useful interpretations based on limited information filtered through personal experience and social context. Individual perception is inevitably partial and perspectival, shaped by specific standpoints and the cognitive tendencies we've explored throughout your journey. Dialogue practices don't eliminate these limitations, but use the diversity of human perspective to reveal blind spots and develop more comprehensive understanding. You notice how these dialogue approaches connect with biases you've already explored, how they help counteract confirmation bias by intentionally seeking diverse perspectives, moderate overconfidence by revealing the partiality of individual understanding, and expand in-group thinking by creating meaningful exchange across difference. These practices don't eliminate these tendencies, but create contexts that moderate their influence and expand awareness beyond their limitations. The meadow path now leads toward a stream where people engage in various forms of explicit reasoning, using structured methods to make thinking processes visible rather than relying solely on intuitive judgment. Some write out arguments in standardized formats that clarify premises and conclusions. Others map decision trees that make options and potential outcomes explicit. Still, others use checklists designed to counteract specific biases in particular domains. This stream reveals rationality practices and decision tools, explains the voice. These approaches recognize that while intuitive thinking serves us well in many contexts, it's vulnerable to the biases we've explored throughout your journey. Rather than relying solely on intuition, these practices make thinking processes explicit, creating external representations that can be examined, revised, and improved in ways that purely internal processes often resist. The meadow shows these practices unfolding across domains. Scientists using pre-registered hypotheses and methodologies to prevent unconscious shifting of expectations based on initial results. Investors following systematic decision processes rather than reacting to market emotions. Medical professionals using diagnostic checklists that ensure consideration of possibilities intuition might overlook. And everyday decision makers explicitly weighing factors that might otherwise receive imbalanced consideration based on vividness or recency. These rationality practices serve as scaffolding for thought, continues the voice. They don't replace intuitive processes, which remain valuable for their speed, pattern recognition capacity, and integration of complex factors, but complement them by making thinking explicit when stakes are high, issues are complex, or specific biases pose particular risks. They work not by eliminating intuition, but by creating structured processes that help guide it toward more reliable conclusions in contexts where its natural tendencies might lead astray. You observe how these explicit reasoning approaches work with knowledge of specific biases, practices that combat availability bias by systematically considering less vivid but statistically significant factors, processes that moderate optimism bias by requiring explicit identification of potential failure modes, and decision structures that counteract present bias by making longer-term impacts more salient in current consideration. What makes these practical approaches significant, notes the voice, its tone growing gentler as your journey through the meadow deepens your relaxation, is how they work with, rather than against, human cognitive nature. They don't attempt to eliminate biases through sheer force of will or abstract knowledge, an approach that research consistently shows has limited effectiveness. Instead, they create conditions that help moderate these tendencies' influence while preserving their benefits, developing what we might call a second-order rationality that works skillfully with the minds we have, rather than imagining we can redesign them from scratch. The entire meadow now appears as an integrated ecosystem of practice, where mindfulness cultivates the metacognitive awareness needed to notice bias in operation. Dialogue expands perspective beyond individual limitations, and explicit reasoning provides scaffolding for more reliable thinking in complex or high-stakes contexts. This visual synthesis helps you appreciate how these approaches work together to develop practical wisdom that acknowledges cognitive limitations while creating possibilities for working more skillfully within them. These practical approaches reveal something profound about human cognition, the voice suggests, its cadence slowing to match your deepening tranquility. True rationality doesn't mean eliminating the evolved tendencies of mind, the automatic processes, emotional responses, and intuitive judgments that serve crucial functions in human life. Rather, it means developing a wise, second-order relationship with these tendencies, the capacity to work skillfully with the minds we have, neither ignoring bias's influence nor imagining we can simply think our way past them through abstract knowledge or force of will. As you absorb this perspective, the meadow's numerous streams converge into a single, gently flowing river that catches the late afternoon sunlight in mesmerizing patterns. This river symbolizes how diverse practices can flow together into an integrated approach to working with cognitive bias, not eliminating these tendencies, but developing wisdom that acknowledges their operation while creating possibilities for greater awareness and choice. As we follow this river toward the final phase of our journey, the voice says, consider how the practices we've explored offer a middle path between two extreme responses to cognitive bias. One extreme treats these tendencies as mere flaws to be eliminated through rationality, ignoring their adaptive functions and the limits of conscious control over automatic processes. The other extreme uses the reality of bias to justify cynicism about human rationality, overlooking our remarkable capacity for metacognition and the practices that can help us work more skillfully with the minds we have. The river now leads toward what appears to be a village nestled in a valley below, a community where the individual practices you've observed in the meadow appear integrated into social structures and institutional designs. This settlement represents the next territory of your exploration, where awareness of cognitive bias translates not just into individual practice, but into systems designed to support more reliable collective thinking and decision-making. As you follow the river's path toward this village, the water's gentle murmur creates a perfect soundtrack for your deepening relaxation. Each step along the riverbank settles you more completely into a state of peaceful receptivity, your body utterly at ease, while your mind remains clear and engaged with the insights unfolding before you. The journey through the landscape of cognitive biases continues, moving now toward understanding how awareness of these tendencies can shape not just individual practice, but the design of systems and institutions that support more reliable collective thought and action. As you follow the river's gentle course into the valley, the village gradually comes into clearer view. Unlike ordinary settlements designed primarily for basic functions like shelter, commerce, and defense, this one appears constructed specifically to support wise thinking and decision-making. Its architecture, institutions, and social spaces all seem purposefully arranged to counterbalance cognitive biases while working with rather than against human nature. Welcome to the Village of Design, the voice greets you, now seeming to emerge from the collective hum of community activity. Here, we explore how awareness of cognitive biases translates into the design of environments, institutions, and systems that support more reliable thinking and decision-making. These designs don't attempt to eliminate biases or override human nature, but create structures that work with our cognitive tendencies while moderating their potential downsides. As you enter the village commons, you notice how its physical design facilitates particular kinds of interaction. Public spaces incorporate elements that naturally bring diverse perspectives into contact. Communication systems make typically invisible processes and data visible. Decision-making venues include features that structurally counterbalance common biases, and various institutions embody practices that distribute cognitive labor in ways that enhance collective reliability. Our first exploration here concerns choice architecture and environmental design, explains the voice. These approaches recognize that our decisions and behaviors are powerfully shaped by the environments in which they occur. Rather than relying solely on willpower or conscious intention to counteract biases, these designs modify environments to naturally guide behavior in beneficial directions while preserving freedom of choice. Before you, the village demonstrates this principle in action. You observe thoughtful designs across domains, public spaces arranged to facilitate chance encounters across social differences, reducing the natural formation of echo chambers, food environments structured to make healthier options more prominent and accessible without restricting choice, financial systems with automatic enrollment in savings programs while allowing opt-out, and information displays that make typically invisible data like energy usage or resource consumption immediately perceptible, enabling more informed decisions. Choice architecture works with rather than against cognitive tendencies, continues the voice. Instead of requiring constant vigilance and willpower to counteract biases, an approach that research shows has limited effectiveness, it modifies environments to make beneficial choices easier and more natural while preserving autonomy. This approach recognizes that attention, willpower, and deliberative reasoning are limited resources best reserved for decisions where they're most needed rather than exhausted on choices that could be supported through environmental design. The village display shifts to show how these design principles influence institutional structures. You observe organizations with decision procedures specifically designed to counterbalance common biases, appointment processes that make diversity a structural feature rather than relying on individual intention to overcome homophily bias, performance reviews conducted using standardized criteria applied before accessing identifying information, brainstorming methods that gather independent thoughts before group discussion to prevent conformity effects, and meeting structures that ensure consideration of alternative viewpoints rather than rushing toward premature consensus. These institutional designs embed debiasing into organizational structure, notes the voice. Rather than expecting individuals to consistently overcome biases through awareness or effort alone, a standard research shows is rarely met. These approaches distribute cognitive labor and create processes that naturally counterbalance problematic tendencies while working with human cognitive nature. As you explore the village further, you notice systems designed to make typically invisible processes more transparent and accountable. Data visualization tools render complex statistics immediately comprehensible. Clear disclosures reveal potential conflicts of interest. Algorithmic decisions include explanations of their reasoning, and various institutions incorporate structured procedures for reviewing and learning from mistakes rather than obscuring them. This aspect of design creates what we might call cognitive transparency, explains the voice. It makes typically invisible processes, patterns, and influences perceptible, enabling more informed judgment and decision-making. Rather than requiring each individual to independently detect these factors, a task our cognitive tendencies make challenging, these designs make important information salient and accessible in ways that work with rather than against attentional patterns. The village now reveals how it approaches collective decision-making and knowledge formation. You observe various institutions implementing structured methods for aggregating diverse perspectives, prediction markets that effectively combine distributed knowledge about uncertain futures, citizen assemblies that bring together demographically representative groups to deliberate on complex issues, scientific processes that separate hypothesis generation from testing to prevent confirmation bias, and decision procedures that explicitly consider perspectives of those not present, including future generations. These collective intelligence designs leverage diversity while managing its challenges, continues the voice. They recognize that different perspectives bring valuable information and insights, potentially counterbalancing individual biases. Yet, they also acknowledge the coordination difficulties diverse groups often face and implement structures that help realize the benefits of cognitive diversity while minimizing its potential costs in terms of conflict or paralysis. You notice how these collective approaches connect with biases you've already explored, how they help overcome the limitations of individual perception shaped by confirmation bias, availability bias, and motivated reasoning. These systems don't eliminate these tendencies, but create contexts where their individual effects can be balanced through structured aggregation of diverse perspectives. What makes these design approaches particularly valuable, notes the voice, its tone growing gentler as your relaxation deepens, is how they distribute the work of debiasing beyond individual awareness and effort. Even the most reflective individuals have limited capacity to consistently recognize and counteract biases through mere intention, especially under conditions of complexity, uncertainty, time pressure, or emotional activation, precisely when bias is most influential. System design creates structures that support more reliable thinking and decision-making without requiring superhuman rationality or constant vigilance. The entire village now appears as an integrated ecosystem of design, where physical environments naturally guide behavior in beneficial directions. Institutional structures embed practices that counterbalance problematic tendencies. Information systems make typically invisible patterns perceptible, and collective processes effectively aggregate diverse perspectives. This visual synthesis helps you appreciate how these approaches work together to create contexts that support wise thinking and decision-making at both individual and collective levels. These design approaches reveal something profound about human rationality, the voice suggests, its cadence slowing to match your deepening tranquility. True rationality isn't primarily an individual achievement, but emerges through interaction between minds and environments, between personal practices and social structures, between individual awareness and collective design. The most reliable thinking happens not through isolated individual effort, but through systems that distribute cognitive labor and create conditions supporting wiser thought and action. As you absorb this perspective, the village square reveals a final dimension of designed wisdom. Here, you observe how the community maintains awareness of its own cognitive limitations through institutionalized humility, structured practices for remembering the partiality of current understanding, recognizing the provisional nature of knowledge, and remaining open to revision in light of new information or perspective. This practice of collective epistemic humility, explains the voice, represents perhaps the highest expression of wisdom regarding cognitive bias. It acknowledges that even the best designs and practices cannot eliminate the inherent limitations of human cognition or the partiality of any particular perspective. Rather than claiming perfection, wise systems build in mechanisms for continuous learning, adaptation, and revision, treating current understanding as the best available approximation rather than final truth. The village square shows these humility practices manifested across domains. Scientific institutions that treat theories as provisional models rather than absolute truths. Governance systems with built-in processes for reviewing and revising policies based on outcomes rather than intentions. Educational approaches that teach the history of revised understanding rather than just current conclusions. And cultural practices that honor uncertainty and openness alongside conviction and commitment. What makes this collective humility especially significant, notes the voice, is how it creates conditions for ongoing growth in wisdom rather than rigid adherence to current understanding. By institutionalizing awareness of cognitive limitations and the provisional nature of knowledge, these practices help communities remain open to perspectives and information that might otherwise be overlooked or rejected, creating the conditions for continuous learning and adaptation. As this final insight settles into your awareness, you notice the village has transformed as twilight approaches. Gentle lights illuminate pathways and gathering spaces, creating a warm glow that invites continued connection and reflection as day transitions to evening. This lighting symbolizes how awareness of cognitive limitations need not lead to darkness or despair, but can illuminate paths toward greater wisdom through thoughtful design and practice. As we prepare to leave this village, the voice says, consider how the design principles we've explored might apply in your own life and communities. While you cannot redesign society single-handedly, you can apply these insights across domains of influence, modifying your personal environment to support beneficial choices, advocating for institutional practices that counterbalance bias, seeking information systems that make important patterns visible, and participating in or creating collective processes that effectively aggregate diverse perspectives. The path leading out of the village appears before you, winding gently toward what looks like a tranquil lakeshore visible in the distance. This final destination represents a place of integration and reflection, where the journey's insights can be absorbed more completely, and their implications for living wisely with awareness of cognitive bias can be contemplated in tranquility. As you follow this path, leaving the village behind, you notice your body feels completely at ease, settled into perfect relaxation that requires no effort to maintain. The gentle rhythm of your breathing has synchronized with your unhurried steps, creating a profound harmony between body and mind. Your journey through the landscape of cognitive biases approaches its conclusion, but the wisdom gained will continue to unfold within you long after this exploration ends. As you approach the lake shore, the landscape opens to reveal a scene of extraordinary tranquility. The water stretches before you, its surface so still, it perfectly mirrors the twilight sky above, creating a doubling effect that symbolizes reflection in both its literal and contemplative senses. Unlike ordinary lakes that simply exist as natural features, this one appears designed specifically for integration, its shoreline offering various spaces for quiet reflection, its waters somehow making visible the connections between ideas, and its very presence inviting a state of receptive awareness where insights can settle into deeper understanding. Welcome to the lakeside of reflection, the voice greets you, now seeming to emerge from both the water and the sky it mirrors. Here, we integrate the insights from your journey through the landscape of cognitive biases, considering their broader implications for how we understand ourselves and navigate reality. This final exploration doesn't add new biases to your map, but helps you appreciate the deeper significance of what you've discovered throughout your journey. As you find a perfectly comfortable spot at the water's edge, the lake's surface begins to display shifting images that recall the territories you've traversed: the Garden of Perception, the Hall of Mirrors, the Memory Archive, the Observatory of Probability, the Social Marketplace, the Crossroads of Decision, the Temple of Narrative, the Mountain of Perspective, the Meadow of Practice, and the Village of Design. These images don't appear sequentially, but in meaningful patterns that reveal connections and themes across domains. Our first reflection concerns the constructed nature of human reality, explains the voice. Throughout your journey, you've discovered how reality as you experience it isn't a direct perception of what exists, but a construction shaped by cognitive tendencies operating largely outside awareness. Perception biases filter what information you notice and ignore. Memory biases reconstruct rather than replay the past. Social biases align your understanding with group perspectives. Narrative biases organize experience into meaningful stories. Together, these processes create the subjective reality you inhabit and typically experience as self-evident truth. Before you, the lake displays this constructive process in action, showing how raw sensory data transforms through layers of filtering, selection, interpretation, and narrative integration to become conscious experience. This visualization helps you appreciate how profoundly your mind shapes what you perceive as reality, not through deliberate fabrication, but through automatic processes that evolve to prioritize usefulness over perfect accuracy. This constructed nature of experience doesn't mean reality is merely subjective or that objective truth doesn't exist, continues the voice. Rather, it suggests that human access to reality is inevitably mediated through cognitive processes that shape perception in systematic ways. The map is not the territory, but we can only navigate by maps, mental models that represent rather than replicate the territories they help us traverse. Understanding this constructed nature of experience creates healthy epistemic humility, recognition that our perception is inevitably partial and perspectival rather than complete and objective. The lake's reflection shifts to show how different cultures, training, and experiences create diverse lenses through which the same physical reality can be perceived. Experts noticing patterns invisible to novices, cultural backgrounds highlighting different aspects of the same situation, and specialized knowledge creating perceptual capacities inaccessible without specific training. This diversity of perception suggests both the richness of human experience and the partiality of any single perspective. Our second reflection concerns the adapted rather than flawed nature of cognitive biases, the voice continues. Throughout your journey, you've discovered how these tendencies aren't simply errors or defects in rationality, but adaptations that evolved to solve specific problems in ancestral environments. Availability bias helped our ancestors focus on relevant threats and opportunities. Confirmation bias created cognitive efficiency through selective attention. Status quo bias prevented constant revision of functional approaches. Social conformity facilitated group coordination, essential for survival. The lake now displays these adaptive functions across contexts, showing how tendencies often labeled as biases or flaws served important purposes in the environments where human cognition evolved. This perspective helps you appreciate these patterns not as design flaws to be eliminated, but as specialized adaptations that continue serving valuable functions alongside their potential limitations in modern contexts. This adaptive perspective doesn't justify uncritical acceptance of these tendencies, notes the voice. Some biases that served our ancestors well may create significant problems in modern environments where conditions differ dramatically from those in which they evolved. But understanding their adaptive origins helps us work more skillfully with these tendencies, preserving their benefits while developing practices, designs, and systems that moderate their potential downsides in contexts where their underlying assumptions no longer apply. The lake's reflection now integrates these first two insights, showing how the constructed nature of reality and the adapted nature of cognitive biases together create both the remarkable capabilities and inherent limitations of human understanding. This integrated view helps you appreciate how the very processes that enable our extraordinary capacity for meaning-making, pattern recognition, and social coordination also create predictable distortions and blind spots in perception. Our third reflection concerns the social nature of rationality, explains the voice. Throughout your journey, you've discovered how human reasoning isn't primarily an individual achievement, but a collective endeavor. Our cognitive limitations are moderated through dialogue that brings diverse perspectives into productive contact. Our individual biases can be balanced through institutional designs that distribute cognitive labor. Our personal blind spots become visible through interaction with others who perceive what we miss. Reliable knowledge emerges not from isolated genius, but from communities with practices that leverage diverse perspectives while managing their challenges. The lake displays this social dimension of rationality across domains, showing how scientific communities, democratic institutions, educational systems, and various forms of structured dialogue all create contexts where diverse perspectives can correct each other's limitations. This visualization helps you appreciate rationality as an emergent property of well-designed social systems, rather than merely an individual virtue or capacity. This social understanding doesn't diminish the importance of individual reflection and practice, continues the voice. Individual metacognitive awareness creates the foundation for participation in collective reasoning. Personal intellectual virtues like curiosity, humility, and openness enable productive engagement across difference. Individual practice with specific reasoning tools enhances contribution to shared inquiry. The social and individual dimensions of rationality don't compete, but complement each other in an integrated understanding of how reliable thinking emerges. As you absorb these reflections, you notice your body has settled into an extraordinarily comfortable state, perfectly relaxed, yet somehow more present and aware than in ordinary consciousness. The boundary between your physical form and the natural environment around you feels unusually permeable, creating a sense of gentle communion with the lake, the sky, and the twilight air. Your breathing has found its natural rhythm, deep and even, supporting both profound relaxation and remarkable clarity of perception. Our final reflection, the voice says, its tone now matching the perfect tranquility of the lake, concerns the possibility of wisdom in the face of cognitive limitation. Throughout your journey, you've discovered how awareness of cognitive biases doesn't eliminate them. These tendencies remain built into the architecture of mind, operating largely through automatic processes beyond direct conscious control. Yet this very awareness creates possibilities for wisdom, not through achieving perfect rationality, but through cultivating a humble, skillful relationship with the minds we actually have. The lake now displays this possibility across territories you've explored, showing how metacognitive awareness creates space between impulse and action, how intellectual humility opens perception beyond the limitations of current understanding, how specific practices help navigate complexity with greater wisdom. How thoughtful design creates environments supporting better choices, and how communities with appropriate structures and norms can achieve reliability beyond the capacity of isolated individuals. This wisdom doesn't require extraordinary intelligence or superhuman rationality, notes the voice. It emerges through ordinary human capacities cultivated through practice, embodied in designs, and expressed through communities. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty, fallibility, or the inevitable partiality of perspective, but it creates possibilities for navigating complexity with greater awareness, humility, and skill, working with rather than against the cognitive tendencies that both enable and limit human understanding. As this final reflection settles into your awareness, the lake's surface transforms one last time. Instead of displaying specific images, it now shows a perfect mirror of the star-filled sky above. Countless points of light reflected with such clarity that the boundary between heaven and earth seems to dissolve. This mirroring creates a profound sense of both vastness and integration, suggesting how awareness of cognitive limitations paradoxically expands rather than constrains our capacity for understanding. As our journey concludes, the voice says, carry with you this integrated understanding of cognitive biases and their implications. Remember that your reality is inevitably constructed through processes operating largely outside awareness. Not to doubt everything you perceive, but to maintain healthy epistemic humility about the completeness and objectivity of your understanding. Recognize these cognitive tendencies not as flaws to eliminate, but as adaptations to work with skillfully, preserving their benefits while moderating their limitations. Appreciate how rationality emerges not just through individual effort, but through communities and systems that distribute cognitive labor and integrate diverse perspectives. And perhaps most importantly, trust in the possibility of wisdom that doesn't require perfect rationality, but emerges through cultivating a humble, skillful relationship with the remarkable but limited minds we've inherited. The stars now shine with extraordinary brilliance, both above in the night sky and below in the lake's perfect reflection. This doubling creates a sense of being suspended in infinite space rather than positioned on solid ground, a physical metaphor for the expanded awareness that comes from recognizing both the remarkable capabilities and inherent limitations of human cognition. Your breathing continues its deep, even rhythm, carrying you towards sleep, while the insights from your journey continue integrating into deeper understanding. The cognitive biases we've explored throughout this journey, the voice concludes, its tone now so gentle it seems to emerge from within your own awareness rather than from any external source, aren't problems to be solved, but features of human cognition to be understood and engaged with wisdom. They reflect the evolved nature of minds, shaped not for perfect accuracy, but for effective action in ancestral environments. Understanding these patterns doesn't eliminate them, but creates a different relationship with them, a metacognitive awareness that honors both the remarkable capabilities and inherent limitations of human understanding. As these final words settle into your consciousness, you feel yourself drifting towards sleep with perfect tranquility. The journey through cognitive biases has not eliminated these tendencies from your mind. They remain built into the architecture of cognition itself, but your awareness of them has been transformed, creating possibilities for engaging reality with greater wisdom, humility, and skill. This understanding will continue to unfold within you even as you sleep, integrating into how you perceive yourself and the world upon awakening. The lakeside scene gradually fades as sleep approaches, but the insights gained from your journey through cognitive biases remain, not as abstract knowledge, but as lived understanding that has become part of how you relate to your own mind and the constructed realities it continuously creates. The cognitive biases that shape human reality haven't disappeared, but your relationship with them has been transformed through the wisdom that comes from understanding the patterns of mind that both enable and limit our remarkable capacity for making meaning in a complex world.